My name is Roslyn Di Sisto. I'm a colourist originally from Australia, but have been living and working in Toronto for the past 5 years. I began my career in my hometown of Melbourne, where right after film school I spent the better part of the next few years learning the ropes in production as a runner and as a production assistant, and eventually worked my way up to doing a few short films and music videos, independent productions. It didn't take me too long though to realise that production wasn't for me. It just felt like moving house every single day, packing the truck, unpacking the truck, stressing about time. So I had been dabbling a little in editing and really enjoyed it, and it didn't take me long to realise that was far more my speed. So I approached a local post-production facility and landed a job in the tape room where I was dubbing tapes and syncing rushes for editors, and something else I got to do in that time was attend FilmLight sessions, which is where my eyes opened to the world of color grading. I was so impressed. It was just the technicality of it and the art form. I loved it. So I set about to find myself a position as an assistant colorist, which I did, and I really hit my stride. I spent the next 5 or 6 years just learning about it and establishing myself in Melbourne, and then eventually worked my way up and ended up relocating to Canada in 2015. Certainly I do think there are some projects that are trickier to grade than others, but generally I think that comes down to the camera work and the lighting really. Say for example there was a project shot on one camera only with limited lensing and predominantly controlled light. It's far more easygoing than say a project that has mixed media and heaps of exteriors and fluctuating light. So I think if a project is shot thoughtfully to begin with, it grades quite easily, and it's nice to be able to sort of exercise your creativity first and then your technical skills after, rather than spending say the first hour getting a complicated first pass down just matching cameras and lighting. Having said that though, I do think that the trickier projects can be quite rewarding, because those are the ones where if you have to work a little bit harder to get there, it feels, a pat on the back is more warranted. And I think, it feels like at the end of it, you've really elevated the project. This question did actually get me thinking about exactly how a technical colorist would approach things differently than say a visual or an instinctual artist. And it's tough to say. I think, generally I think there's an expectation among, well, at least professionally working colorists, to be able to hold your own technically and understand the tools and the technology. It would be pretty tough to get by in today's age just purely twinkling your fingers over the color wheels and passing off all of the tracking and the troubleshooting to an assistant. So yeah, I think you probably need a little bit of both. A little bit of nerdiness and a little bit of imagination as well. Okay, jumping over to Basslight here, the first thing I'm going to show you is how I would tackle a sky replacement. Now, generally the types of sky replacements I would do are a lot more subtle than this one, but for the purpose of the exercise, I figured I would demonstrate something a little more dramatic. So the first thing we want to do is just give the image an overall moody look to get us halfway there. Now, I've pre-prepared something here in the interest of time, which is just a super simple video grade, some adjusted levels and saturation. So once I'm happy with that grade, I'm then ready to start the sky replacement. So I insert a layer here and select under the layer mode drop-down, matte from key. This will bring up your browser window where you're able to navigate to your sky library and pick whichever sky makes sense for your shot. In this case, I'm going to select Storm Clouds Time-Lapse and insert that. So you'll notice here that there's a new active hue angle. This may also be a D key depending on what your default keyer is set to. So now I'm ready to make a selection for the part of the image that I want to replace. I'll make some quick adjustments here, but you might want to spend a little bit more time here perfecting the key. Generally, when working specifically with sky replacements, as a way to soften the edges of the key, I tend to favor using the roll-off function here within the keyer rather than adding a matte tool. I just find that the matte tool isn't quite as forgiving sometimes when there are thin lines in the frame. So for example, if there were power lines going through the sky, the matte tool can sometimes just create a bit of a halo, so I tend to avoid it when I can. I'm also going to create a shape to help isolate the area I want to replace, because as you can see, there's a little bit of bleed happening on the field. So I'm just going to mask that out. Just create a very super simple rectangular shape. And blur the edges of that shape a little bit just along the horizon line there. So the next thing we want to do is position the clouds where we'd like them. So over here in our background, we don't want to adjust our foreground. We want to adjust the background we've replaced. I'm going to select transform, and then I'm just going to play around a little bit with the positioning of these clouds. Now you may notice that these clouds are time-lapsed, which I personally don't want to utilize today. I'm just going to make it very subtle. And so how I'm going to do that is create a still from that movie file. I'm going to come up to the input strip of the sky itself, and I'm going to set the increment to 0. Now, if you want, you can mess around a little bit with this offset until you're happy with the exact frame. So now that I'm happy with the positioning of the sky, I'm going to track it. And depending on what the shot itself is, will determine which tracker I choose. I tend to start with an area tracker because it's usually pretty spot on, but in this case, because I don't have a clean horizon line and there's a subject right down the center, I'm going to choose to do a 2-point track. So I'll place my 2 tracking markers in some high contrast areas either side of my subject and track from there. That looked pretty good to me. I'm going to return to the strip. Now the first thing you need to do here is remember to switch the stabilize invert button. If you don't do that, I'll play through what this will look like. So that's not what you want. So once we click stabilize, that looks much better. So there's one last thing that I'm noticing is I can see the drift of my shape a little bit. So we do have to attach a tracker to that shape so that that tracks along with it too. Now finally, you would want to integrate the sky into your scene. So we could create video grade here, take some of these levels down a little bit, perhaps introduce a little bit of that blue. And then one other persnickety thing I'm noticing is that the sky is quite clean compared to the image in the foreground. That is actually because the image itself has been shot on 16mm film, so there's quite a bit of noise. So I'm going to come back here and change this operator to add grain, and I'm just going to increase the intensity of that grain until I feel good about it. So there we have a sky replacement.
Something I've really loved about working in the short form world is that, often on my busiest day, sometimes I can get 2 or 3 sessions through in a day, and I'll have to switch between them back to back. And of course, more often than not, every project is really different. It has different cameras, different lighting, different genres, and of course, each of these projects require their own very individual look and feel. So I think that really gives colorists an opportunity to exercise their skills, and it helps me to be able to find new ways of giving each project an identity. So yeah, I think that's really fun. Having to switch mindsets so regularly, I think, helps to keep you on top of your skills and keep you trying new stuff. And also working on things like music videos and fashion projects whenever you can. I mean, those are the best for inspiration and for finding new and interesting ways of doing things. I mean, you'll find that so much of the trends in advertising tend to come from pop culture and music videos and stuff like that anyway. So yeah, it's sort of, I feel like you really have an upper hand if you can sort of keep a bit of a finger in each pie, a bit in advertising and a bit in music videos when you can. I really love doing music videos and fashion stuff. It's some of my favorite because it really calls for a lot of expression in color.
I'm going to show you here how I tackled a request to change the identity of this hotel. I used 2 really different methods to paint out parts of this signage, which I'm quickly going to demonstrate for you here. Firstly, I'm going to use the paint tool with the perspective function to eliminate the letter D from grand and change it to the letter A. The first step is to insert a paint layer. Then I'm going to click the overlay button, followed by the perspective plane button here, and also making sure that all these 3 options below are checked off. Okay, I'm ready to set my perspective. So I'm going to add 4 points here around the sign. There we go. Seeing the grid here is a really easy visual representation of the set perspective. I'll zoom back in here so I can see what I'm doing. I'll deselect the overlay and perspective plane buttons now, and I'm ready to start using my paintbrush. Okay, I'll set the brush to the size I'd like. I'm using shortcuts right now on my laptop, so Command and drag will set your brush size. So now using Control drag, I'm going to set my clone, source, and target points. In other words, cloning the A and setting the target to paint over that D. Now, very slowly, because the size and spacing of these letters, I'm going to gently start to paint over that D. Right now I'm on my mini little trackpad, so if you're using a pen, this will make it a lot easier to control and you'll be able to get a bit more intricate with the painting. All right, very quick and dirty cleanup here, but you get the idea. Okay, great. Now let's track it. Select my area perspective tracker and set my points the same as the original perspective. Cool, that's ready to track. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'll return to the strip. Looks good. Okay, now for the date. I'm going to remove this altogether. And rather than using the paint tool, I wanted to show you an alternative method I often like to use, depending on the nature of the paint request. I'll zoom in here again to see better detail. Okay, next I'm going to add a shape, shortcut S evidently, and I'm going to draw a box around that date. I'll head over to my operators and change one here to transform. And from there, I'm going to use my controls to adjust the Y position only, which essentially is just moving the image north to cover that date with what lies directly below it. This method generally is a little more effective when you're working with a dead-on shot or when the line of perspective is pretty subtle. Now I'll track that shape. All right, let's see how this all looks. Looks good. Now we can add VFX artists to our LinkedIn profiles.
I will say that when going back and forth on the pros and cons between, say, Basslight and another system and talking to other colorists about it, Basslight has really come out on top in that respect. I spent more than half of my career on a completely different system. So when I migrated to Basslight, after the initial adjustment period, of course, definitely a rocky start to that relationship. But once I familiarized myself and got over that initial hump, it was so easy to see why colorists can be quite passionate about Basslight. I think put simply, it's just a really sophisticated system, and more so than some of the others I've worked on. And I think that the depth of the capabilities really puts it on top personally for me, because I'm still learning new stuff every day. I'm learning new tools and new approaches to things. And I remember the first time that I found out that Basslight saves every single keystroke right back to the creation of the job, making it almost impossible to lose work. That was a huge game changer for me. So yeah, especially when you're working on a slate or a blackboard and like you're working really quickly, your grade can progress so fast, so quickly. So yeah, that function really blew my mind, among others.